I think one of the key things when we're talking about succession planning and protection is to have the conversations early, have the conversations with the right people. And I think when we talk about succession, what we often think about is actually ownership and passing ownership down to future generations. And I think in that context, we do need to think about what happens to the movement of shares, what's their value. But you can do succession planning 5, 10, 15 years in advance. Succession planning shouldn't be the year before mum and dad retire, or if dad gets ill or granddad gets ill, oh dear, what do we need to do? So what I would say to anyone listening is that succession planning is more than just how do we move the shares. It's actually, have we got the right management structure in place? Are we bringing people through the business? If we've got kids, maybe they're down in London, are they going to want to come back to the north or wherever the business might be based? We need to have those conversations. Sorry, my earpiece has just told me my battery's low, apologies. And so I think the other thing I want to talk about in terms of succession is preparing for that, really. And that isn't just about shareholder agreements, it's also around how your business operates. Have you got key management in place? Do you have people that can actually run the business if someone gets ill? What controls do you have over them, whether that means operationally? Do they have shares, for example? How does that factor in? So I think it's really important that when we talk about succession, we aren't just thinking simply about moving a share from A to B. But inevitably, that is one of the key things that people focus on. And what we can do through shareholder arrangements is set the rules to that game. So you may want shares to remain in the family. You may be happy for shares to be transferred out. But it's really important that as part of this planning, we discuss that with you and work out what are the things that you are comfortable doing and what your objectives are in terms of where you might end up. So those sorts of conversations need to be had in a wider context with other advisors, your accountants, and people like yourselves, Kathryn, who can advise on some of the estate planning issues as well.
Yeah, I think certainly if we're talking about family companies, Richard, we're not necessarily going to be looking at options there, are we? And certainly the aim, certainly for us as teams, is to sit down with families at an early stage, as maybe the children are coming through and starting to work in the business, or indeed when it becomes apparent that none of them is going to want to work in the business, and understand what the future is going to be. But I mean, I suppose the bedrock of that, the starting point is, well, then what if something unexpected happens? Mum and dad die before we've done all of that work, and then it is about the wills and making sure that those are appropriately structured to take matters forward. And I do think for family companies it can be very, very difficult indeed. I mean, again, if we've got mum and dad both still alive, I think my starting point would be think very carefully before just allowing shares to pass to a surviving husband or wife. We may be saying, look, this business is here for the long haul, but everybody's got the price. Things sometimes happen. The rules change. We had a cross-party discussion paper only a few months ago with some very radical suggestions about business property relief, and you'd be pretty miffed if you had business property relief when dad died, and by the time mum died it had gone and she just got the shares. So again, I'd always think let's have a look at that conversation. What should happen on the first step? But the most difficult stage by far is, well, when mum and dad have both gone and we've got the children, because if you're really lucky, it's very straightforward. You might have a couple of children, both working in the business, both at a similar level, and it's quite straightforward. You just give the shares to them. But more often than not, it's a lot more complicated than that. More often than not, you've got...
Yeah, I've just lost my microphone. Can you still hear me, Kathryn?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
So apologies, I'm kind of a little bit deaf now. My battery's gone in my earphones. I'll try and sort that out. But yeah, you're right, and I think probably worth talking about some of the things that we see, actually, some of the issues that we see, and some of the do's and don'ts, really. And so when we're having these conversations, there is a temptation sometimes to just give shares to the kids. The kids might be coming into the business. We want to give them some shares. Again, that might sound like a great idea, but actually, if these shares are, for future generations, what's the purpose that you're trying to achieve there? So I do think before you give things away, you need to think, actually, what happens if we sell the business, and we've got an 18-year-old kid who might own 20%? Do we want them to have that access to the cash? Do we want them to have a say in voting if they own voting shares in the business? So I think you really need to sit down as part of this process and work through the implications of what you're doing and what you want to achieve. And there are often other ways of doing it. Similarly, you may have a child who looks like they're going to take over the business, and really, what's the point at which they do that? And do they have shares, or do they have some sort of interest in the trust? What if they get divorced? These are the sorts of issues that we need to think about. If you've got kids that are getting married, maybe you need to think about prenuptial agreements. The divorce courts do have very wide-reaching powers to set aside pretty much anything that we can put in a shareholders agreement. But that doesn't mean to say that courts won't look at what's in there. So it is worth thinking around valuations of shares when we're transferring them, ownership of shares, prenuptial agreements, and getting the management team in the right place. So I think that's a really big part of this whole process. And again, it's not something that you can actually do in 5 minutes or do offline. You need to sit down and run through the scenarios, and often go down different avenues which you may have not expected to go down.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you learn, certainly as long as I have, is that every case is different. There is not one size that fits all, and you do need to sit down and have some detailed discussion. But certainly, that there's very much a case for family trust in all of this. Maybe the children who are working in the business, they can have salary, they can have bonuses when things are going particularly well, but shares themselves are held there for the benefit of everybody going forward. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that if people do just blithely leave their shares to their children, looking forward as to what might happen when we get to the second or third generation. I mean, certainly I've dealt with companies maybe started by 2 brothers, they have 3 children each. So by the time the next generation, we've got 6 people owning the shares, and before you know it, it's 18, it's 20 odd. And once you get to that stage, it's really difficult then to have any meaningful control over decision making relating to the company. And certainly I've been involved in discussions where you're then looking at how do you start to claw it back. So family trusts are a really useful vehicle there.
I think that's true. And I think also one of the things we're seeing a lot of now is family investment companies, of course, which is really, something that we're seeing a lot more of. It's a similar kind of idea to a trust. And often what you'll find with family business is that all the value is in the business, which is great. But you will have children working in the business, not working in the business. And in some respects, you can have all your eggs in one basket. So what we see a lot of now with clients is they try and de-risk by maybe taking some value, some cash out of the trading business, setting up a family investment company, which is a separate corporate entity, which is used to maybe diversify some of the investments and grow the family wealth outside of the main business. And they can be incredibly flexible. You can have different rights attaching to the ownership of family investment companies, so that you can effectively give access to varying different assets in different ways to different children. You can have trusts as part of that arrangement. And I think it's a really, really useful tool for perhaps more mature businesses. Rather than having loads of cash on your balance sheet, you may want to extract some of that and think about diversifying it. But you can still do that in the context of a family business. It's just an investment business. And we're certainly seeing a lot more of that. And I think they're really flexible tools. Can be some tax advantages in the sense that any wealth that's grown in a family investment company is subject to corporation tax. Obviously, there are issues when you extract that wealth, which you might want to talk about. But I do think when you talk about succession as well, it's not always about who takes over the sort of family business. It's actually succession of the family wealth, and where you've got children who perhaps don't work in the family business, but still have obviously some right to the family wealth, a family investment company can help achieve that. And the classic example might be where you have a family business where son's taken over or daughter's taken over. Some of the siblings don't necessarily work in the business, might not be interested in the business. Their inheritance, if you like, is very much bound up with the way their sibling runs the business. So taking some of that value out and putting it in a separate pot with perhaps a slightly more diverse range of investments is another way of actually protecting the family wealth, but also giving access to it through means other than share ownership in a trading entity.
Yeah, and it also gives some control there, doesn't it, Richard? I mean, if we've perhaps got younger, children that they're not mature, they're not married yet, they're not settled yet, then a family investment company, again, it's very akin to trusts, isn't it, in terms of the protection and the control which mum and dad, for want of a better phrase, are still able to exercise. And as you say, we will use those in conjunction with trusts, won't we, putting shares in the investment company into trust, so to ring fence that growth outside somebody's estate. I mean, they're quite sophisticated discussions, but they can achieve an awful lot for people who have worked jolly hard over the years in growing successful businesses, can't they?
That's right, and also a good vehicle where we've had a number of clients who've perhaps sold the family business and use some of the sale proceeds to actually invest and loan money into a family investment company to sort of carry on the family business, but perhaps in a different way. So again, something that is quite sophisticated, but needs to be thought through. And you mentioned earlier around multiple generations, and something I wanted to touch on is as each generation passes, it gets harder and harder to sort of control the influence of family members. Typically, a first generation business has a very different feel and look to a second, third and fourth generation. And as we all know, by the time you get to third or fourth generation, you've really got no idea of what the kids are going to be like. They may have gone off the rails, they may not be interested, you just don't know. So one of the things we see sometimes for larger family businesses where there are multiple generations, and some of these things have been put into place. So you may have lots of beneficiaries who have an interest in the business, but not necessarily the sort of day-to-day involvement or control. And that's where some of the concepts around family charters or family councils can come in. And these are a sort of a mechanism whereby the family still has a line of communication with the directors of the company. So you have a structure whereby there is a formal process whereby the family get the rights to certain information that they wouldn't be entitled to perhaps as beneficiaries under a trust. And they have an opportunity to communicate and let the management of the family business understand how they might feel about certain things, or actually have explained to them the rationale that is going on. So again, less of a succession tool, but actually a way of keeping some of the ethos of the original sort of founding fathers of the business in the ongoing operation of the business. So you may have a sort of set of family values which you don't want to lose, but clearly you can't have every generation making a decision based on what great granddad might have done. So that's another tool in the box that we can talk to clients around, in terms of as families sort of get bigger or maybe more complicated with modern families are not necessarily the classic nuclear family. There are ways in which you can maintain the sense of the family business whilst it actually may have grown to something that is very much a corporate vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess there's an element there of trying to close the stable door after the horse is bolted, isn't there, Richard? But, there are still advice we can give and value we can add there. But if I can just rewind maybe to the beginning of the session, Richard, when we were talking about the shareholder agreement and circumstances in which a shareholder may be required by his fellow shareholders to sell his shares or vice versa. You mentioned incapacity. I mean, I think what we are seeing more and more these days in the context of shareholder agreements, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a requirement that if a shareholder is to retain his shares in the event of incapacity, it needs to have an effective lasting power of attorney in place.
Yes, it's a good point. And again, classic reason to sort of think about these things when you're not incapacitated, because obviously it's too late. And I'm sure you're going to talk to us a little bit about lasting power of attorneys and how they can be used. But yeah, it's a really useful tool, because so often the problem we face with family companies who haven't gone through this process, or other companies, but especially family companies, is at the time when you most need to be able to deal with these issues, if you haven't thought about them in advance, you can end up with none of the tools. You may not have a core at board. You may not be able to actually undertake exactly the things you need to undertake, because you haven't actually got the right people around. So yeah, I mean, if you could perhaps maybe talk a little bit about LPAs, that'd be really useful.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and forgive me if some of you are aware of this already, but it is a common misconception that, for example, if you're a married person and you were to lose capacity, you were to have a terrible car accident, become very ill, have a skiing accident, your husband or your wife would automatically be able to step into your shoes and manage things for you. That is not the case, I'm afraid. In the absence of there being an attorney already appointed to manage your affairs for you, the question of somebody applying to the Court of Protection for a deputyship order, and that can take about 4 months or so to come through. And that can have a really drastic effect. I mean, say we've got a company, it's in the middle of trying to refinance. And somebody has a terrible accident, and they're not qualified and you can't get a decision. Or I don't know, what have you got? Somebody seeking to buy your business at the current time. You've got a really great offer on the table. The buyers have got alternatives, and suddenly everybody's got to sit on their hands for 4 months. I mean, that can be calamitous, really. So, I mean, our advice would be to everybody, really, that you ought to have a lasting power of attorney in place in respect of both your financial affairs and indeed health and welfare decisions. I think the recently retired public guardian himself said he was hoping we'd be in a situation before long where having lasting powers of attorney in place was important as having a driving licence. We're not there yet, but certainly, I mean, I would always advise clients when I'm talking to them, even if they're only in their 30s and their 40s, and we're not thinking about dementia or Alzheimer's or anything like that, you could have a terrible accident. You could be Michael Schumacher, who doesn't make it off the ski slope. And what will happen to your business in that situation?
No.
And you want to choose, don't you, who's going to be the right person to step into your shoes? So really, really important decision there. So, sorry, Richard, you were about to interject.
No, I think that's just the point, actually, that so many of our clients work so hard at building businesses and growing businesses and managing everything that goes with that. And we're all probably guilty of this to a certain degree, don't spend enough time actually stepping outside and thinking, if I'm doing all this, what's the point? And most people are doing it for their families. And if you don't have the opportunity to pass it on, you have to question why you're doing it. And it's very, very sort of current at the moment. We're in very difficult times, very uncertain times. But it is an opportunity when you go through this process to look at everything. So, have you looked at your will recently? If your kids are getting married and you've got some family wealth, think about a prenup. This isn't something that only happens on, American TV shows. You can get prenups in this country now. Think about, what will happen operationally and practically in the circumstances. And if you don't know, come and chat to people like us, and we can tell you real life stories of, this is what will happen or won't happen. How would you feel about it? These are some of the options that you've got that we can do. And the way the process tends to work, as you know, Kathryn, is we have a discussion, we get people in, have a sort of wide discussion around sort of themes, really around expectations, what people want to do, how they feel about certain things, send them away to have a think about that, and then come back and go through a more detailed list of questions, which may just end up with, a relatively simple arrangement, or it might provoke some other conversations. Maybe you decide actually you don't want to hand the business over, you want to sell it, in which case there's a whole different set of conversations. Maybe you've decided actually that you've thought about it and you don't want to hand stuff over to the kids, you don't think they're ready for it, you don't think that they're capable of doing it. So maybe you need to spend some time preparing them, training them up, which is less of a legal issue. But what I would say is, you know, having that conversation is never going to be something that isn't worthwhile. It's not just lawyers sort of marketing their services. It's actually something that most of you do in the pub with your friends or around the board table. But actually formalising those conversations is really beneficial, because there is some art to this. There's some tax issues, there's some legal issues, but equally there are solutions to most of these problems. And I don't think I found anyone who has gone through this process and hasn't found it valuable, and I've got plenty of clients who haven't and have spent a huge amount of time, money, trying to put the genie back in the lamp, and of course you never can. So it's time well spent, and I'm sure we've probably got questions from people who are listening in. Very weird to be having this conversation with ourselves without a client on the opposite side of the desk, and apologies if we've bored you all silly, trying to anticipate some of the questions you might have. But if you have got questions and you're you can send them through, and we can either pick them up now or deal with them afterwards. He said, to silence. Now we've got one of our guys on the line who's meant to be flagging any. So Wayne, if there are any questions there, if you want to pop them up, or if anyone has a question they want to sort of unmute themselves and ask us, that's fine too.
Yeah, we've none come in, Richard. So if anyone does want to ask one and unmute themselves, feel free. Nope.
Fine. Well, I don't blame you. I wouldn't either in this forum. But you've got our contact details. The idea of this was really just to have a chat. It's the first webinar I've done, so I'm sure it'll be better next time. But hopefully what it does give you a sense of is that there's never a bad time to think about this sort of thing. There's a lot of help out there. This isn't a one-size-fits-all. Every single situation will be different. I would hope that between us we've probably encountered most of the challenges that you all might face. If you want to have a chat with us, we're delighted to do that. There is no cost involved in talking to us about this stuff, and we'd love to hear from you, whether that be through email with some questions, or if anyone wants to pick up the phone. Our contact details are readily available. Let us know. There are some innovative solutions to some of these problems, but actually sometimes it's actually quite dull and quite boring and quite easy to just put something very basic in place which will give you peace of mind. Or it might just actually force you to spend the time which you've been putting off, actually getting yourself together with your family members and actually talking through some of these things that you're always too busy to talk about. And we're certainly finding at the moment that a lot of people are reflecting not just on their business lives, but on their personal lives. And if ever there was an example of a time when actually that's a good thing to do, now is probably it. So, Kathryn, unless you've got anything else, I think...
good morning, Kathryn and Richard. Forgive me for... good morning. It's Ben Berry here from English Lakes. I don't know if you can hear me just right, but yeah, forgive me for butting in at the end. Really enjoyable presentation. Thanks very much for putting it on, and some interesting points which you know, we'll have to consider. One of the ones that we don't have to consider but is interesting, you mentioned about the cross options. I just wondered what happens when the last person dies.
Well, if you have a finite number of shareholders and there's no one left to take them, the cross options don't really work there. So what you're effectively back into is a proper succession planning discussion. So in that scenario, if there is no one that you would hand the shares to operationally, or maybe actually the guys that run the business, it's all their kids, that's when you get into a different discussion. If there's no one to take it over, then you have a number of issues really. You can shut the thing down and just distribute the assets. You can try and market it and sell it, although that'll be an interesting job when you haven't got a management team or a set of engaged shareholders. Or you can get yourself in a position which we sometimes see with family businesses where there are no obvious people to take it over, and it might be distant cousins, where you have a professional a professional board who run the business, and the ownership of that business is often placed in trusts for distant relatives. But if you are in a position where that scenario is possible, if there is a situation, it's probably because there's not been enough time and attention given to your thought about succession planning. So a cross option wouldn't really help you then, but some of the other tools that we've got might. And frankly, if I was in that position and I didn't necessarily have anyone to leave it to, you might want to think about, well, actually, why am I doing this? If there's no one to pass it on to, maybe I should think about cashing my chips in and heading to Vegas or whatever your thing is. But it's a good question, and I think it probably illustrates why having these kind of discussions is useful, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years before that might occur.
Yeah, I mean, just one thought on that actually is I'm working with a client at the moment, and he and his business partner, neither of them have family who will be looking to take their business forward, and what they've decided they'd like to do is to leave their shares actually to each other in their wills. But what we're working on at the present time is some form of option for particular members of the management team to have the opportunity to purchase the business from the estate of the last man standing at a discounted price. And that's what we're working on at the moment, because they would really like to see that business continue for the benefit of those individuals and their families. So that's what you might want to look at in that kind of scenario.
And similarly, I've had clients who have been independently wealthy and have wanted to leave their legacy to charity. Now, if you're a charity, getting a load of shares in a private company is probably not ideal. So again, finding a buyer for that business and converting into cash, whether it be through an existing management team or a trade buyer, is something that they've been looking at. And in that scenario, they've found a buyer. They're going to liquidate the assets, and then they will distribute it in accordance with their other inheritance tax planning. But there'll be a large number of charities getting, very generous amounts of money. So I think it just confirms the point really that doing it early and having the conversation early is the best way to go. Any more questions? I'm listening. Sorry, you're probably seeing my ear because for some reason the sound's gone. So I apologise for being as close to the camera as I am. It's not something anyone should have to face, especially on a work call. But any more questions from anyone? Any more comments, or actually you may have an experience that that would be useful to share. Please feel free. Great. Well, in which case, you've got our contact details. This is being recorded, so we'll be available on the website if you want to watch us on catch up. Can't imagine anyone will. Get in touch with us if there's anything that's come out of today which you think we can help with. Failing which, thank you, Kathryn, and thanks everybody else, and we'll hope to hear and see some of you very soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.